everyone, and welcome back to Ancient History Jewelry Stories, your favorite podcast about jewelry history that just so happens to be celebrating its 1-year birthday today. Technically tomorrow, but I figured 364 days is good enough. As an avid enjoyer and listener of podcasts, I never thought I would have a podcast of my own, and when I started this back in May after doing videos for a few months, I had no idea what I was doing. A year later, this is pretty much still true, although I have really enjoyed making these podcast episodes. Unlike the videos, which are generally less than 3 minutes long, these podcast episodes have allowed me to do more research, get much deeper into topics that I enjoy learning about, and to share that information with you, the lovely people listening out there. And while yes, it does seem like every millennial has a podcast of their own, I do think this one is a topic that generally isn't being covered that often, so I'm happy to be finishing this first year of podcast episodes, and I'm looking forward to year 2. For those of you who are finding me for the first time and wondering what the hell this is and what we're all doing here, welcome! My name is Melise. I am a goldsmith trained in ancient techniques, and I am a huge nerd and lover of history. This is a podcast series and also a video series where I examine history through the lens of jewelry, which, in my opinion, is the most important form of art and adornment that humans create. The video series is also called Ancient History Jewelry Stories, and you can find that on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube under the username moonhoney.jewelry. I tend to upload videos and sometimes image posts between 3 and 5 times a week. If you've been following along for a while, or at least listened to last month's podcast episodes about the Masters of Art Nouveau jewelry, then you will know that this month, as well as last month's podcast episode topics, were chosen by you, the people listening. I asked everyone to help me determine what the podcast episode topics were going to be for last month, and it ended in a tie. The Masters of Art Nouveau jewelry, and this month's topic, the art of faking it, a history of jewelry forgeries. These topics were determined by a set of polls on Patreon, which is the only way to give me suggestions on what you would like to see in future content. The first poll was for all of my Patreon members, and then we narrowed it down to 3 top options, which were voted on by my paid Patreon members. If you want to be able to vote in polls in the future, or you want to be able to see some Patreon-exclusive imagery to go along with these podcast episodes, you can find it at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. The polls are usually for the $5 a month paid tier, but sometimes I do break them up into 2 sets of polls, with the first round of voting being open to all of my Patreon members. For this month's topic, which I think is a great way to celebrate the podcast's first birthday, I'm going to be breaking it up into 2 parts. This episode about jewelry forgeries is going to be specifically about gemstone forgery, how humans have been faking precious gems for thousands of years. As Pliny the Elder said, to quote Pliny the Elder, "There is no other kind of fraud practiced by which larger profits are made." And that does still seem to be true in the world of jewelry forgeries. In 2 weeks, the next episode in this series is going to focus on actual faked ancient jewels, a huge problem that is plaguing the antiquities market today. So without further ado, let's discuss the incredibly clever and very creative ways that unscrupulous humans have been cheating other humans out of their money for shiny rocks for thousands of years. The earliest known jewelry forgeries, so to speak, date back over 4,000 years. In the form of substitutions intended to look like more precious and more valuable stones. Or organic materials in this case, because some of the oldest known pieces that were intended to look more expensive than they are fake amber. Of course, without historical context, it's impossible for us to say if some of these pieces were intended to deceive, or if it was known that this was not true amber and was just being used as a substitute to save cost. Various other tree resins could be mistaken for amber and were far more widely available. Pieces made out of various carved tree resins that weren't amber were also found in King Tutankhamun's tomb. Although again, without historical context, we can't be sure if these tree resins were also prized in their own right, or if they were simply intended to mimic amber. With the wealth of riches found in King Tutankhamun's tomb, you would assume that these pieces would have been considered valuable on their own, because a pharaoh wouldn't necessarily need any fakes. But, as we will see in a few minutes when we talk about turquoise and lapis lazuli, there were plenty of imitations found in many royal tombs in ancient Egypt. Amber was not only being substituted with other tree resins, but by the time of Pliny the Elder in ancient Rome, amber itself was being used to fake other gemstones. Pliny describes how amber could have been used to mimic other transparent stones, such as amethyst, which, for the majority of its history, was considered to be as valuable and rare as diamonds. He describes a technique in which amber could be heated to increase its clarity, which is still a technique used today, and goes on to mention that it could be colored and dyed to mimic other gemstones, like purple amethyst. There was also the practice of creating composite amber, which was when many pieces of amber were stuck together to create a much larger object. This practice probably predates the Romans, going back to the ancient Greeks or maybe even the ancient Etruscans. There is also a record from the Renaissance era. Da Vinci himself described that you could create fake amber by hardening egg whites with heat, which sounds absolutely disgusting, honestly. And in China, where amber has been highly prized for almost 2,000 years, there are records of fake amber dating back to at least 500 CE. Amber is unique because in order to create a facsimile or replica of valuable amber, you would use another organic material. Other stones were easier to fake using other methods. If you think of ancient Egyptian jewelry, your mind probably conjures up an image of dark blue lapis or bright blue turquoise nestled in a setting of deep gold. I have discussed the history of turquoise, especially in ancient Egypt. If you want to learn more, you can listen to the episode on the history of turquoise, but it was actually not as abundant or as often used in ancient Egyptian jewelry as you would suspect. Yes, it was mined in Egypt, specifically in the Sinai Peninsula, where it is still being mined today, but it was fairly rare, and it still is. True gem-quality turquoise is not that easy to come by. A lot of what we use today is composite turquoise, or stabilized turquoise, or outright fake turquoise, and it turns out this was also true in ancient Egypt. In modern times, archaeologists, conservationists, and researchers have started to take a harder look at ancient Egyptian artifacts and jewelry, and have discovered that quite a bit of what we just assumed was turquoise, or lapis, is actually glass, or faience, or enamel. In some objects, this is fairly obvious. You can look at larger carved pieces of faience, and it's immediately clear that this was not originally a large chunk of turquoise. Faience does not have the matrix running through it, the dark lines that you often see in pieces of turquoise. But in others, it's not so obvious. There are some pieces that have a combination of both true turquoise and imitation turquoise, probably intended to stretch the material. There are pieces in King Tut's tomb that have imitation turquoise in them, so this assumption that a pharaoh with all of the worldly goods that a person could possess wouldn't need imitations is not necessarily true. It does seem that because turquoise was in fairly short supply, imitations would be used to create an air of splendor, to lend brilliance to pieces using the colors that are expected of ancient Egyptian jewelry, even if the materials weren't necessarily readily available. And just a side note about faience, because this can be confusing, and I've gotten it wrong quite often in the past. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art's website seems to have their definition wrong entirely. It's often said to be a type of glazed stoneware material, but this is not entirely true. It is more accurate to call it a sintered quartz ceramic material. When it's heated, it develops a glossy, bright glass coating or glaze, and the color of this glaze, and also the inner color of the material itself, is determined by the mineral and chemical composition. A lot of these pieces are bright blues and turquoise colors because they contain an abundance of copper. This isn't the same as a modern ceramic glaze. If you break a piece of ancient faience, the inside is going to be the same color as the outside. You find a shitload of faience through ancient Egypt, ancient Greece, and ancient Rome. This was a very popular material, and if you see pictures of it, you can see exactly why. It could be molded, it could be carved, it was bright, glossy, shiny, and it did a very good job at mimicking both lapis lazuli and turquoise. And again, I'm going to be saying this multiple times throughout this episode, without proper historical context, it's impossible to know how often these sorts of materials were intended to deceive, and how often it was understood that they were simply a visual replica. In the same way that nowadays, most of us would not expect that a rhinestone is pretending to be a diamond. It's a pretty simulant that you can have for a much, much cheaper price. This is not the only way in which colored stones were simulated. Glass eventually became a very popular choice for making replicas or facsimiles of colored gems, especially transparent gems. To quote the archaeologist Roger Morey, "The desire for rare colored stones was so great that it stimulated the development of artificial gemstones, made first, before about 2000 BCE, of glazed dull stones or faience, and increasingly thereafter of glass." Although it remains fairly unclear how many of these ancient examples were intended to deceive, it is clear that by the time of Pliny the Elder, in the 1st century CE, there was a robust trade in forgeries, that is, stones intended to deceive the buyer into believing they were buying something far more valuable than what they were actually getting. Pliny wrote about this extensively, and he had feelings about it. As I said at the top of the episode, he is quoted as saying, "There is no other kind of fraud practiced by which larger profits are made." He also wrote that faking gemstones was a, quote, fraud against society. And Pliny, I am inclined to agree with you. This problem seems to have been widespread enough that he felt the need to write about how to identify these fake gemstones. He wrote that there were, quote, blisters in the body of the fictitious stone, filaments, and an unequal brilliancy. And if you're buying a gem where the color seems too vibrant, too deep, too even, too good to be true, then that's a pretty good indicator that it probably is too good to be true. Pliny also noted that you could test these stones by checking their hardness. He wrote that diamonds could scratch other gemstones, but not vice versa, which does tell me that there was already a trade in fake diamonds in the 1st century CE. And he specifically called out fake rubies, saying, quote, "They are counterfeited, too, with great exactness in glass." Since rubies have pretty much always been valuable, it's no surprise that they're a stone that people have been trying to fake for thousands of years. And, coincidentally, or maybe not, rubies just so happen to be the very first gemstone that humans learned to synthesize in a laboratory. We'll get back to that. Another gem that you see faked quite often in ancient Rome and through the Byzantine era is emerald, both with glass substitutions and with other less valuable stones that just happen to be a similar color. It seems that, aside from amber, lapis, and turquoise, rubies and emeralds were the two most often faked transparent gemstones in the ancient world. Coming back to Pliny the Elder, who had so much to say about fake gemstones, he even mentions that there was a way of faking sardonyx, which is a variety of banded agate, or hard stone, which was most often used for carving cameos, with the different layers of color in the stone being used to create different colors in the cameo itself. He says, I quote, "Sardonyx, for example, is imitated by cementing together 3 other precious stones, in such a way that no skill can detect the fraud, a black stone being used for the purpose, a white stone, and one of a vermilion color, each of them, in its own way, a stone of high repute. Nay, even more than this, there are books in existence, the authors of which I forbear to name, which give instructions how to stain crystal in such a way as to imitate smaragdus, the ancient name for emerald, and other transparent stones, how to make sardonyx of sarda, and other gems in a similar manner." And I'll use that quote as my lead in to what I think is the most interesting part of this podcast episode, the Stockholm Papyrus. This is a collection of alchemical recipes. They were compiled between 200 and 300 CE. They are from Egypt and written in Greek, and they are composed of 15 loose leaves of papyrus. I believe that the Stockholm Papyrus contains some of these texts that Pliny the Elder is talking shit about. Because this collection of 15 loose leaves of papyrus contains the instructions for taking stones like selenite, topaz, moonstone, and coloring them to look like emeralds, aquamarine, rubies, and other precious gems. And I know this has been a lot of quotes in this episode so far, but this is worth it, I promise. I'm going to read you some of the most interesting recipes from the Stockholm Papyrus. Let's start with the bad bitch of gemstones, ruby. This is the treating of crystal so that it appears like a ruby. Take smoky crystal and make the ordinary stone from it. Take and heat it gradually in the dark, and, indeed, until it appears to you to have the heat within it. Heat it once more in gold founder's waste. Take and dip the stone in cedar oil mixed with sulfur, and leave it in the dye, for the purpose of absorption, until morning. That one seems pretty straightforward, nothing super weird in there. Cedar oil is actually still used to oil emeralds to reduce the appearance of internal fissures and inclusions. So what's the next one? Let's see. Preparation of carnelian. Dissolve alkanet in oil. Alkanet is a type of dye. After that, put in the blood of a pigeon, and fine Sinopian earth and a little vinegar in order that the blood does not coagulate. Place selenite or some transparent stone in it. Close the vessel and place it amidst the dew for 10 days. If you wish to make the stone very brilliant, arrange it so as to wrap it in horsehair. Tie this on and put it in the dye bath. Pigeon's blood is a weird ingredient, but it's even more intriguing because the bright red variety of ruby is known as pigeon's blood. Now, some of these recipes are a bit alchemical, a little esoteric, so I wonder if the pigeon's blood actually served a purpose, or if, just like placing it amidst the dew for 10 days, it was a little bit of magic included in the recipe because it was believed to do something but didn't do anything at all. Now we have the preparation of emerald. Take and put so-called topaz stone in liquid alum, and leave it there 3 days. Then remove it from this and put it in a small copper vessel in which you have placed pure, unadulterated verdigris along with sharp vinegar. Verdigris is the green oxidation you get on copper when it reacts with acid. Put the cover upon the vessel, close up the cover, and gently keep a fire under the vessel with olive wood for 6 hours. Otherwise, the longer you maintain the fire, the better and deeper will the stone be. Only, as I say, with a gentle fire. Cool and lift the stone out. Its condition will show whether it has become emerald. That is to say, you will observe that a green film has formed upon it. Let it become slowly cooled, however. If not, it soon breaks. Put oil in a small box tree vessel many days beforehand so that the oil is purified and the product from it can be taken off. Put in the stone and leave it under cover 7 days. On taking out, you will have an emerald which resembles the natural ones. This one's interesting because it seems to make it clear that this fake emerald is not a stone that has been dyed the whole way through, but rather a stone that has developed a colored film over its surface, much like mystic topaz or other fumed gemstone varieties today. And the last one I'll read to you. This is a very quick one, so if you wanted to make your own fake gemstone in a hurry, I recommend this recipe. It's the preparation of beryl. Here I have to assume they mean aquamarine. Blue beryl was often referred to as just beryl. Tie crystal around with a hair and hang it in a pot, along with the urine of a she-ass for 3 days. But the crystal is not permitted to touch the urine. The pot should be closed, however. Then place the pot over a gentle fire, and you will find a very good beryl. So if you find yourself with some spare crystal, 3 extra days, and a she-ass, you too can make yourself a quote-unquote very good beryl. I found an account from Marjolaine Boll, who is an expert on alchemic craft art and material culture from the Middle Ages, where she recreated the recipe for emerald. She seems to think that this could have produced a very convincing stone if done properly. Her experiment resulted in what looked to her, and she says the untrained eye, like a genuine emerald. Of course, if the Stockholm papyrus papers have been around since the 3rd or 4th century CE, that means that they were probably at least slightly common knowledge, if not fairly well known. And that means that people knew that there were all of these ways to create fake gemstones. And where you have fake gemstones, you have to have ways to test if your gemstone is real. And on that note, I have one more quote for you. This is from a 15th century book written by Johannes de Cuba, and it is a method for determining the authenticity of your garnet. And just a side note, at this point, this would have been known as carbuncle, and is not just the garnet that we know today, but carbuncle would have referred to garnets, red zircon, some varieties of ruby, and some types of spinel. There wasn't really a good, or let's say scientific way to determine which red stone was which. Johannes de Cuba says, "If the owner of a garnet ring who was not an expert in precious stones wished to assure himself of the genuineness of his garnet, the following rather troublesome experiment was at his disposal. He was to disrobe, still wearing his ring, and then to have his body smeared with honey. This done, he was to lie down where flies or wasps were about. If in spite of the sweet temptation they failed to light on his body, this was a proof that the garnet was genuine, an added proof being that when he took off the garnet ring, the insects would hasten to make up for lost time and suck up the honey." Sorry, but this sounds like a very shitty way to find out that you bought a fake garnet. Not that I believe that a real one would have kept the wasps from fucking you up in the first place. It wouldn't be until about 2 centuries later when we would start to get the beginnings of the modern art of gemology. This is when they first determined that rubies and red spinel were in fact 2 completely different kinds of mineral, and it stopped people from having to smear themselves in honey and let the wasps come for them to determine if their carbuncle was genuine. In our modern world, we have no shortage of simulants, synthetics, lab-created stones, and the majority of these are not intended to be deceptive. Most of these are intended to be lower-cost alternatives to expensive natural stones. We have cubic zirconia and moissanite as diamond simulants. We have synthetic sapphires, rubies, emeralds, spinel. There are all manner of lab-grown stones these days, which are sold as lab-grown stones. Most of these are not being sold to unsuspecting consumers as the real deal. Although, it does happen, and this is, of course, why we have rules and regulations surrounding things like gemstone marketing. Even something like a lab-grown diamond, which the lab-grown diamond industry will tell you is nearly identical to a natural diamond, has to be honest and upfront about what you're buying, a lab-grown diamond. And though humans have been laboring to create synthetic variants of gemstones for thousands of years, it's actually a fairly new science. The first true synthetic gems were created in the late 1800s, and, back to the bad bitch of gems, the first ones were rubies. The push to create synthetic rubies came about not only because people wanted a more accessible and affordable gem to wear, but because the watchmaking industry relied on sapphires and rubies for internal movements. The very first synthetic lab-grown rubies were created by Edmond Fremy and his assistant, Auguste Victor Louis Verneuil. That is one hell of a name. These were initially very small crystals, and they weren't very useful. There were a few pieces of jewelry made with these tiny ruby crystals set in them, and they were used for some watch movements, but they had very limited application. That is, until 1885, when all of a sudden, dealers in Geneva began selling large, high-quality rubies. These were being marketed as natural, and there were quite a few of them on the market. Very large, very clear rubies are incredibly rare and incredibly expensive, so this started setting off alarm bells in various jewelers, and they asked scientists to start examining these stones. A chemist and mineralogist by the name of Charles Friedel decided to take a closer look and reported that, yes, they were identical to natural rubies until they were viewed under a microscope, where he noted that there were bubbles of trapped gas within the stones, which were a telltale sign that these had been created in a laboratory. Word got out, and there was quite a scandal. Many dealers were forced to refund their customers large amounts of money. And to this day, who created these stones and where they were made remains a mystery. Somebody had figured out how to create nearly perfect synthetic rubies, but we don't know who. These stones did, however, inspire Verneuil to create his flame fusion technique to produce larger ruby crystals, and this was the gold standard in creating synthetic lab-grown rubies until the modern day. Shortly after, he used this technique to create synthetic sapphires as well. Humans had finally figured out how to create gemstones from scratch. And yes, they were less expensive and less valuable than the natural mined gemstones, but they were still incredibly popular. They were in huge demand. All of a sudden, you could own a very large, very brightly colored ruby for a fraction of the cost of a natural one. You see a lot of jewelry from the late 1800s and the early 1900s sporting lovely, hot pink, eye-clean rubies in fairly large sizes. The scandal of the mysterious lab-grown rubies being sold as natural rubies also started the push to regulate the gemstone market. Laws and regulations were put into place that stipulated that lab-grown gems had to be sold as lab-grown gems. They could not be sold as natural, they could not be sold as quote-unquote authentic. There was to be a huge distinction between those made in a lab and those mined from the earth. And that still holds true today. If you are looking for synthetic or lab-grown stones, you're doing so on purpose, whether because you are morally opposed to the mining of gems or because you're looking for something at a lower price point. That's not to say that there isn't dishonesty in the world of jewelry, but for the most part, if you're buying a lab-grown gem, it's because you went out of your way to find one. There are, of course, instances of people selling vintage or antique lab-grown gems without knowing that's what they are. That's why it's important to do your research and buy only from reputable sellers if you are buying something vintage or antique. Or if you come across something at a price where you think this is worth the risk to you, then you bring it to someone knowledgeable, a gemologist, or you send it off to somewhere like the GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, and have the stone certified. Something that I myself have encountered when making jewelry out of heirloom inherited jewelry is the pieces that have been claimed to be real natural stones by someone who knew damn well that they were fake. I have been sent grandma's diamonds only to find out that they were cubic zirconia. I have been sent grandma's star sapphire only to find out that they were lab-grown star sapphires. And in almost all of these cases, they were purchased by someone who knew that they were synthetic. Whether Grandma herself knew would be up for debate, but if they were a gift from, say, Grandpa, it's pretty safe to say that he knew what he was buying. It's always disappointing to have to tell someone that what they thought was a fairly valuable family heirloom was, in fact, not. So my little bit of unsolicited advice, don't give someone the gift of a synthetic or lab-grown stone without being honest about it. And with that, we come to the end of episode 1 of The Art of Faking It, a history of jewelry forgeries. As you can see, humans have been faking gems for thousands of years. Of course we have. We will find a way to make a profit if there is a profit to be made. Whether created intentionally to fool someone into paying more for something than it was worth, or created to offer a lower-priced option to expensive, rare-colored stones. People have found all manner of clever ways to create imitations, whether or not they include pigeon's blood. If you want to see more recipes from the Stockholm Papyrus, there are plenty of websites that have them listed. I think this is a document that you can easily find if you just Google it. I don't recommend that you go out there and follow some 3rd century alchemical texts to try to create your own fake gemstones. If you do, you are doing so at your own risk and not with my endorsement. But if you do, let me know how it goes. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that you enjoyed learning about all of the crafty ways that humans have been deceiving each other for thousands of years. In the next episode, we're going to cover the fairly significant problem of fakes in the world of ancient jewelry. A problem that's been around for a few centuries, but has really only gotten worse with the advent of 3D modeling and 3D printing, and of course, the internet. Until then, you can find my videos on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube under moonhoney.jewelry. You can join me on Patreon at patreon.com/ancienthistoryjewelrystories. You can see my jewelry and the work that I make using ancient techniques at shopmoonhoney.com. If you haven't already, like, follow, subscribe, whatever option your preferred podcast listening platform gives you. And if you are on YouTube or Spotify, leave me a comment. I love reading the comments. They make me so happy, and just last week I discovered that I can actually respond to the Spotify comments. I didn't realize that was an option. I thought they were just there for me to read. So definitely leave me your feedback, unless it's negative feedback, in which case, keep it to yourself. As always, thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and I'll see you in 2 weeks for more ancient history jewelry stories.